All right, welcome to our second video in Module 16, where we're going to be looking at the digestive system. And with animals, right, or basically all living organisms, not just animals, they need nutrients to survive, right? And the nutrients provide building blocks for organic molecules, provides energy for cellular processes. And so those molecules that they make or intake is a big necessity. And plants, if you remember, are autotrophic, meaning that they photosynthesize and they make their own organic molecules, their own carbohydrates that are used for energy. However, animals are the opposite and are known as heterotrophic. So we have to um, consume other organic molecules in order to take up the necessary molecules that we need in order to undergo our cellular processes and to generate energy. The biological molecules that animals consume are molecules like proteins, fats, and complex carbohydrates. Now, this is different from the biological molecules that we actually need. We need amino acids, lipid molecules, nucleotides, and simple sugars. But if there's one thing that you notice, especially from our early module where we talked about organic compounds, is that amino acids come from proteins, lipid molecules come from fats, simple sugars come from complex carbohydrates. And so what this means is that we can break down these larger biological molecules that we initially consume into the components or the monomers that we need or that our body needs in order to function appropriately. And so the process of digestion is um, taking in those biological molecules, breaking them down into the molecules needed, and absorbing those molecules. So the digestive system does that. Okay. And so if we look at the different components of the digestive system, we have our oral cavity, which is where our food goes in, travels down the esophagus into the stomach, which then moves into the small intestine and then the large intestine, and then we release the waste out of our anus. Now, there are also accessory organs, the liver, the gallbladder, and then the pancreas. And we'll talk about each of these different structures as we move through this video. And so to start with, we'll talk about where digestion begins, right, which is the oral cavity or the mouth. The mouth begins digestion with the physical breakdown of food. So the food is masticated from a larger material, larger pieces, into smaller pieces via the teeth. And then our salivary glands, which are shown here in this bottom figure, release enzymes in our saliva. One of those enzymes is amylase, and that amylase begins to digest the starches. So starches immediately begin to be broken down when the saliva is mixed with that food. And then whenever we swallow, the tongue will help move that bolus of food into our esophagus. And we have this structure called the epiglottis, which is a little cartilaginous flap that will fold down over the trachea so that the food will go into the esophagus and not into our larynx, where we could potentially choke on it. Once the food is moved into the esophagus, there are these contraction actions that propel the food towards the stomach. And these contractions is called peristalsis. And so you can imagine if you have, a popsicle, those little frozen popsicles that are in the long kind of tubes. You push on the bottom, and that pushes the popsicle out of the top. That's basically what peristalsis is it will have a contraction behind the food bolus that will push it down towards the stomach. So those contractions will move that food bolus towards the stomach, and then it will have to pass through the esophageal sphincter, which is a smooth muscle that will open and close to allow food to move into the stomach, but it also prevents the chyme, the material that's in the stomach, from going back up into our esophagus, because the chyme is acidic, and the acidity of the chyme could actually deteriorate the cell lining that is in our esophagus, and that's actually what heartburn is. Whenever you feel heartburn, that is the chyme coming back up through your esophagus, and that's what that burning sensation is that acid. Now, once the food passes through the esophagus and goes into the stomach, the food will then interact with several different substances. Okay? So in the stomach, the material is typically around a pH of 1.5 to 2.5, so very acidic. Okay? The stomach releases several different substances. One of those is hydrochloric acid, which is HCl, and other enzymes. Okay? One of those is pepsin, which breaks down protein. Okay, so you have the hydrochloric acid, you have pepsin that's breaking down and digesting this food. And then there are these peristaltic contractions that are still happening in the stomach that is churning that food and causing it to mix with the hydrochloric acid and the enzymes. Now, when the mixture of the food and the hydrochloric acid and the enzymes is all together, we call that substance the chyme, right? So this C word here, this is chyme. That substance will leave the stomach and enter the small intestine, and it leaves via another sphincter, and this is called the pyloric sphincter. Okay, and the stomach can tolerate the acidity, the low acidity, or I should say the high acidity, the low pH, because the stomach secretes mucus. There's a mucus lining that lines the tissues of the stomach, and that mucus helps to protect the stomach from the hydrochloric acid and prevents it from breaking down those cell walls, or not cell walls, but the cell layer, the tissue layer. Now, if there's something that causes that mucus to become broken down, then you will get a stomach ulcer, and you'll get what's called peptic ulcers, and that's where basically the stomach lining has been deteriorated due to the acid. And I've heard it can be very painful. Luckily, I've never experienced it, but heard it's painful. And so once the chyme is made with that mixture of all the other substances, passes through the pyloric sphincter and into the small intestine. Okay. The small intestine is where most of the digestion happens, the further breakdown of the proteins, the fats, and the carbohydrates. Now, the small intestine can be separated into three different components: the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. Okay? The duodenum is the beginning, jejunum is the middle, and the ileum is the end before it gets and merges with the large intestine. Now, in the duodenum, you have a lot of stuff happening. Okay, the duodenum is where that chyme first enters, and remember that chyme is very acidic, but the small intestine can't handle the acidity, so that acidity needs to be neutralized. And the way it does that, the way the body handles that, is that the pancreas will release bicarbonate, and that bicarbonate will neutralize that acidity within the chyme and bring the pH back up so that it doesn't deteriorate the tissue lining within the small intestine. The pancreas also will release many different digestive enzymes to help break down those molecules that are in the chyme. Now, the liver will also release bile. So the liver and the gallbladder work together on this. And we'll talk more about the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas in a little bit, but we're just briefly going to mention that the bile comes from the liver and the gallbladder via the bile duct, which enters right into the duodenum, the beginning of the small intestine. And the bile has these bile salts that will basically emulsify lipids and help to kind of break those lipid bubbles, lipid globules down so that they can be moved across the cell membrane. So they're basically broken down into their fatty acid tails and their glycerol heads, moved across the cellular membrane into the cell where they're then reassembled into triglycerides. And so the small intestine is where a lot of that digestion happens and where the absorption of the broken down molecules and the water occurs. So most of that absorption occurs throughout the small intestine. And now when the food travels through the small intestine, it will then end up in the large intestine. So the beginning of the large intestine is the cecum, and then the large intestine itself can be broken down into 4 different regions: the ascending colon, the transverse colon, the descending colon, and then the sigmoid colon, which is that little twist here. And then after the sigmoid colon, you have the rectum, and then the exit of the rectum is the anus. The cecum is interesting because this is where we can have, this is where humans have microbes that are beneficial and help aid in the digestion process. And then this is also where the appendix is located. Now, the function of the large intestine is to reabsorb any remaining water from undigested food and to store that undigested food and waste before it's eliminated out of the body. Okay. And then we mentioned that there are 3 accessory organs in our digestive system. And so we've talked quite a bit about those already, but I just want to go through and make sure we understand what these accessory organs are and what their roles are in digestion. So those 3 accessory organs are the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. Okay? The liver produces bile that aids in the digestion of fats, and it also helps to remove waste from our body. The gallbladder actually concentrates and stores the bile that is developed in the liver. So the liver will make the bile, then the bile will go into the gallbladder where it's stored, and then when it's needed, it will move out of the gallbladder and move into the small intestine through the bile duct. And then the pancreas, which is located right underneath the stomach, kind of right behind the large intestine, is where the bicarbonate comes from that helps to neutralize the acidity of the chyme as it enters the small intestine. And it also helps to releases other digestive enzymes that help to break down the food as it moves through the small intestine. And there's one really interesting thing I forgot to mention about the small intestine is that, all of the absorption happens here. And the small intestine has a unique kind of structure in that, let's say, this is a portion of the small intestine. Right? Inside that small intestine, there are folds. And so let's say there's like folds in the tissue. Okay? These folds in that tissue help to increase the surface area. And then what's even more interesting is if you zoom in onto one of these folds, say like this, you then have these microvilli, which are more folds on top of that. Right? And so they have all of these folds in the small intestine. This is very bad drawing, I know. But you basically have larger folds that have smaller folds on top of it. And the whole point of this is to increase the contact area in which that food and water can come into those biological molecules. And so it increases the efficiency of absorption. And so that microvilli and villi structures allow for increased rates of absorption in the small intestine. So just a little thing I forgot to mention when we were talking about the small intestine. All right, and so that's pretty much our general overview for the digestive system. In the next module video, or the next video for this module, we'll speak about the respiratory system, and then we'll talk about the circulatory system. Okay? And so with that, that's it for this video, and we'll see you in the next one.